In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Bible Interact presenters uncover the depths of God's Word and reveal the Hebraic foundations of the Christian faith. We encourage you to participate with us. You can view our DVD presentations, make use of study guides and workbooks, and invite our presenters to speak to your community. You'll find all of this and more on the Bible Interact website, where you can also experience Bible history and culture through our online archaeology museum. The photo gallery allows you to enjoy the land of Israel with pictures and videos. You can even listen to exciting lectures through our continuing education program.
Shalom, I'm Dr. Dinah Dye with Bible Interact. Welcome to the Design in Scripture series. This particular series, we're going to look at the birth pangs of the Messiah. This is going to actually be an 8-part series, and we're going to go piece by piece and try to explain exactly what the birth pangs are. I know a lot of you are probably familiar with the Matthew 24, very famous eschatological passage that talks about the birth pangs coming. The birth pangs meaning the beginning of the famines and the pestilence and the earthquakes, etc., all called the beginning of the birth pangs. So it seems like a very covert use of the word. We don't really find it anywhere else in Scripture, although there are allusions to the coming forth of children and birth pangs associated with that. In the prophets, we see this expressed as the writhing of a woman in labor, bringing forth children. So that it is a theme and it is a pattern that we find, not a dominant one in particular, but one I feel is very important. And so we're going to go through it, and we're going to analyze and look at some of the rabbinic literature, see what the rabbis had to say about the birth pangs. What did they mean? What did they think about it? And then we're going to systematically go through and look for key words and terms that are pointing us to the birth pangs. So we're going to start in Genesis, of course, at the beginning. We're going to see what perhaps rabbis or some of the commentaries had to say about birth pangs in terms of the creation. And we're going to follow through, look at some examples like Eve, Hava, the prophecy there about how she will bring forth children in pain. We're going to look at the story of Noah. We're going to trace through elements of Abraham and Lot, and we're going to look at Rachel, who brought forth her son, Benjamin, and birth pangs that came with that. We're going to look at Moshe, and we're finally going to look at, in our 8th session, elements of what's in the prophets. Now, I don't intend to go into that in a lot of detail. I'm hoping by the time I lay a lot of groundwork, a lot of foundation, that you can take these elements and then you can go into the prophets themselves and spend some quality time, research and study, and really let the idea of the birth pangs be revealed. So the birth pangs, as I said, the birth pangs of the Messiah is not a term that we actually find in the Scriptures, although we have that one element there in Matthew, and we do have a reference as well in Thessalonians. But as a phrase, it's not really found in the Scriptures. Something that rabbis have coined in the literature. And it does reflect the time of the coming of the Messiah and, most importantly, the time of the final redemption. It's not talking so much about the sufferings that the Messiah endured, but the sufferings of the world that are accompanied by the time that the Messiah comes in his second coming in his fullness, when the redemption comes in its completeness. So the literature says it is speaking of an act of deliverance that brings the liberation of the exiles and the restoration to the land. So I'm going to kind of weave that theme in this first session, talking about the deliverance and the restoration of the exiles of the people of God coming back to their land, because there's an association with the birth pangs and the return to the land of Israel. Now, the birth pangs are an essential part of the kingdom because we have the concept of children coming forth through this birth. You can see that in Romans 8. We'll talk about that in a moment. But as the whole earth is groaning and the sons of God, the children of Israel, the children of God being born, and they're being born in this pain of travail, of labor pains, of the birth pangs. And so this process of redemption brings forth children. This is what is really important, kind of foundational. There is the bringing forth of children through the process of the birth pangs, and this is all part of the redemption. And of course, accompanying the redemption is times of great trial and suffering and tribulation and difficulties, etc. The idea is that when the suffering is the greatest, the redemption is the nearest. So we can take hope in that. The imagery of the labor pains casts this particular time in a time of great difficulty. And my feeling is, try to imagine all that the enemy would use against God and his economy and the children of Israel on the preventing of the coming forth of children. He would use everything in his arsenal to prevent that birth from happening. And so at that time we're going to see a great explosion of evil and cataclysmic events. The natural result of the enemy, I believe, trying to prevent the redemption, the final redemption from happening. Now, the key to all this, we go to Deuteronomy 6:17, which it says, "Observe diligently the mitzvot, or the commandments, and his instructions, and his laws. Then if you do what is right, you will enter and possess the land. If you don't, if you follow after other gods, you will be expelled from the land." So all through the history of Israel, we see them. They're in the land, they're out of the land. You know, they come back, they're in exile. This is a constant thing that goes on with Israel all through Scripture. The final redemption, of course, will bring Israel back to the land in totality. And so part of the birth pangs is this accompaniment of Israel coming back to the land. My feeling is that Israel has probably spent more time in exile out of the land than she has spent in the land. Of course, over the history of the nation of Israel, we can go back and see all these various empires that continually oppress Israel or continually come against her and take her into captivity in one way or one form. For instance, we see Israel going down to Egypt, and eventually she ends up in captivity there. The Assyrians come and oppress her and take the northern tribes and scatter them throughout the empire, the Assyrian Empire. Babylon comes against her. The Medo-Persian Empire comes against her. The Greeks come against her. The Romans come against her. And this is the pattern all through Scripture. Now, sometimes she's in the land, oppressed by foreign enemies, and sometimes she's removed out of the land. Sometimes she's removed out of the land as the northern tribes Israel, sometimes moved out of the land as Judah, separated. So this goes on through all our 6,000 years of history. But eventually a day will come in which all of the children of Israel, all of Judah, all of Israel will return back to the land in permanence. And that's the key. There will be a time appointed by God in which this is a permanent thing, Israel in the land. Now, a modern example of what I see as the redemption process of Israel returning to the land, we can identify this at World War II. So if we look at the situation of the land of Israel pre-World War II, we see that, yes, there are Jews living in the land. It's not an official nation at this point. Arabs and Jews are actually living together at that time. But then we see World War II happen, the great suffering, trials, and degradation that the Jews experienced. Of course, the death of 6 million Jews under horrors that we can't even describe. Horrors inflicted upon the Jewish people, I believe, probably the worst since the beginning of time. And this process, we see that from World War II, what results, and that is the return of the land of Israel. It is now a nation called Israel, and the children of Israel, the Jews, have returned back to the land. So in a way, World War II is kind of a snapshot or a picture of this process of redemption, of these great trials and sufferings, to bring about the birth of a nation and the return of that nation to the land. I believe that in the future, that World War II is a snapshot of something that happened, but in the future it will be so much worse, on a scale unimaginable, on a scale we can't even describe, but the redemption will come forth. And so World War II is simply a precursor of something that's to come. As I said, over the course of 6,000 years, Israel has been subjugated and oppressed by all these different empires, both in and out of the land, and all her attempts to throw off the yoke of bondage are in vain, because ultimately, at a time appointed by God, he will throw off that yoke of those oppressors, and he will destroy the enemy of Israel. And so these empires, all through history, are considered to be rather ungodly and unrighteous nations, Gentile nations, viewed as like the sea, the masses of people, and the pagans, those that are against God himself. And ultimately, judgment will come upon all these empires and all these nations and all those that are outside the economy of God. We would call them Gentiles or pagans or whatever you want to call them. Judgment will come, and that particular judgment is also associated with the fullness of the birth pangs at the time appointed by God at what we would call the end of days. As I said, the land is really the key. The land was given as a promise to Abraham, and his seed. And so figuring into the birth pangs, you cannot separate out the importance of the land and the redemption that will bring Israel back to the land. In all this, and it sounds terrible, but there is a scripture that I find great comfort in from Isaiah 26. And if you go back and read Isaiah 26, you'll see that the context of that particular chapter, 26 and 27, has very much to do with the birth pangs, and it talks about a woman writhing in labor and bringing forth children. So this particular scripture is in that context, and it says in verse 20, "Come, my people, enter your rooms and shut your doors behind you. Hide yourselves for a little while until the wrath is past." And so for those of us who are in Messiah, who our faith is in him, our faith is in God, the one true God, we can rest assured that we are under his shelter, under his wing, in his room, and he will protect us until the wrath is past. Now, how that protection comes, I'm not going to define it. It's not a guarantee that something, your physical life won't be taken from you. But however, the essence of who you are and your spirit will be protected for eternity from the enemy of God. So let's kind of shift gears here a little bit. And much has been written in the literature about the birth pangs, as I said, not so much in the scriptures. And we can find in the Apocrypha, in the Pseudepigrapha, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, in Josephus, we can find elements of the birth pangs described there. Now, as far as the scriptures are concerned, we will find some in the Torah and the prophets. Even in the writings in the book of Psalms, there's a reference there in Psalm 48 to the birth pangs. And we will also find references in the Gospel and the epistles. For instance, Matthew 24 in the Gospels. And in the epistles we find in Thessalonians, in Galatians, and also, I just forgot the last one. But there are elements in which that the reference there, Romans is the other one. Okay. Now, many of the apocalyptic writings will describe in stark detail this period of the birth pangs and how they would accompany the time of the Messiah, the onset of his days. The apocalyptic literature writings came on the scene in about 250 BCE up until the time about 200 of the Common Era. Now, this is its own distinct literary genre, and it is of Jewish origin. And part of this genre deals with biblical prophecy, eschatology, sort of otherworldly events. Of course, the book of Revelation and John's description is probably our best example of apocalyptic literature. The book of Daniel also, elements in the book of Zechariah. And in the literature, the book of Enoch has a lot of descriptions that are associated with the birth pangs and a lot of apocalyptic descriptions. And even the book of Enoch, also you'll see similarities there with the book of Revelation itself. And of course, this time, as I've already said, is accompanied by great cosmic cataclysms being visited upon the earth, famine and pestilence and earthquakes and hail. And that should immediately remind you of a previous time, the time of Moshe, when the children of Israel come out of Egypt. These same cataclysmic events are associated with that. And what's the idea? They come out of Egypt, their oppressor is destroyed, Pharaoh, drowned in the sea, And the idea is that they are going back to the land. So there's an association with the birth pangs and the return to the land, although we know it takes them a while to get there. They're out in the wilderness for 40 years, but that's another story. This is a time of unparalleled evil in the history of mankind as we're leading up to the future time of the birth pangs. And all through history, when we've had these elements of birth pangs, we've seen great oppression against Israel, great cruelty, tyrants rising up. It's a time where truth seems to be lost. It's a time in which men seem to have no fear of sin or the consequences of sin. It's a time in which it seems every man does what's right in his own eyes. If we relate back to Judges, it's a time of great corruption and decay and apostasy on a scale we can't even imagine, although we can imagine some of that today. It is, in fact, so bad that the sages say that they don't even want the redemption to come because of what's going to happen. It's a time that people will despair that the redemption will even come. And in Talmudic times, the sages say that they didn't wish to see the Messiah because they didn't want to have to go through the time of this upheaval and the time of the birth pangs. Now, another name for this period of time in Scripture is called Jacob's trouble. And it doesn't say in Scripture Jacob's trouble in that form, but where the rabbis get it from is from Jeremiah 30. So let's go over there. We're going to look at verse 3. It says, "For the day is coming when I will reverse the exile of my people Israel and Yehudah, and I will cause them to return to the land I gave their ancestors, and they will take possession of it." So notice the context. The context is the return of Israel and Judah back to the land. And then it further goes on to say, "Can men give birth to children? Why then do I see all the men with their hands on their stomachs like women in labor, with every face turned pale? How dreadful that day will be. There has never been one like it. A time of trouble for Yaakov, a time of trouble for Jacob, but out of it he will be saved." So this is the scripture in which this understanding of Jacob's trouble associated with the time of the birth pangs, a time of the final redemption. This is where it's taken from it. But out of this great time of peril and trouble, Jacob will be saved. Out of it, all Israel will be saved. Now you can associate that particular scripture with Romans. Now, the association repeats here with the birth of the children, coming out of exile, and returning to the land that's the promised inheritance to all the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it further goes on to say in that particular passage, "And on that day I will break his yoke from off your neck." Now, that yoke would come from Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and that yoke would be broken off from their neck. "And I will snap your chains, and foreigners will no longer enslave him." My imagery here is that the chains being snapped is kind of like the cord being removed so that children can be easily born. So all of this associated with these varying empires. In this particular case, it's going to be the Babylonian Empire. And as I said, God very specifically tells him here that part of this redemption, part of this birth, has to do with the land and the return of Judah and Israel, and eventually all of the offspring back to the land, to the country that they have been exiled out of for so many years. Now, many of the ideas of the birth pangs, as I said, were from the Apocrypha and come to us through a period called the Hasmonean dynasty. And this particular period leading up to the time of the birth of Yeshua the Messiah was a time of a great expectation of the coming of the Messiah. Of course, by the time we get closer to the Messiah, we see that Rome is the dominant empire that is oppressing them and ruling over them. But we see examples of this, of the Hasmonean period in the book of Daniel. For instance, Antiochus Epiphanes, the king of Syria, the one who is of the Seleucid rulers. Now, at this particular time of Antiochus Epiphanes, the Seleucids are controlling Israel. They are the ones oppressing Israel. And it is, in fact, a time of great oppression over Israel. You know the story of Hanukkah, and they were not allowed to read the Torah, study the Torah. It was a capital crime. They were not allowed to circumcise their children. Antiochus Epiphanes even had forced some of the Jews to let their babies literally die from around their neck if they were circumcised. capital crime to set aside the day for Shabbat, etc. So this messianic expectation was very heightened at that time. They wanted to throw off the yoke of the Seleucids, and eventually, as I said, leading up to the time of the Messiah, they wanted to throw off the yoke of the Romans. And so, of course, when Yeshua comes, who's this deliverer to come and the king of the Jews, they're expecting him to deliver them from these empires, and he doesn't do that. Instead, he delivers them individually from their sin. So it was probably difficult for some in that period to grasp the idea that this one came, this Messiah came, but was seen as a suffering servant and not a conquering king. So there was probably a time of confusion for some who believed that truly this one would come and deliver them. And of course, over that whole period of time, and even coming up into about 135, the Common Era, at the time of Hadrian, we see many messiahs coming and going, and false messiahs, etc., because they were hoping so much for one to come and to deliver them from their enemies. Now, another book from the Apocrypha, actually from the pseudepigraphic writings, is one called 4th Ezra. And in this particular rabbinic literature, there are many signs of the Messiah in it. It was actually written, as I said, from the pseudepigrapha. It's the 4th book of Ezra, and it was written between 90 and 100 of the Common Era, and that should remind you that the book of John wrote, Revelation, around that same time. So you can see similar imagery and patterns between these two. I would encourage you to read the 4th book of Ezra. But he said something was said in there that was very interesting. And that particular book, 4th Ezra, was written in Hebrew, and it was written in Israel, which at the time was called Palestine. And it says that the heel of the first age is Esau, which is identified with Rome. The hand of the second age is Jacob, and that is identified as Israel. That the beginning of a man is his hand, and the end of a man is his heel. So it's talking about the end of this age in which Rome rules, and the beginning of this age in which Israel rules, or the final kingdom to come. And they say that there's no interval between them, since the hand of Jacob had a hold of the heel as Esau. Isn't that interesting? That ought to take us back to the birth of Esau and Jacob, the twins that came forth out of Rebekah, Rivkah. And in 4th Ezra, he asks God to show him the end of wonders. And we can see that in Daniel 12:6. Behold, the days come, when the age which is about to pass shall be sealed, and I will show these signs. And the book shall be opened before the face of the firmament, and all shall see. And suddenly the sown places appear unsown, and the full storehouses shall suddenly be found empty, and the trumpet shall sound aloud, at which all men shall be struck with sudden fear. Now, of course, that part is from 4th Ezra. And at the same time, friends shall war against friends, like enemies. The earth shall be stricken, and it shall be whosoever shall have survived all these things that I have foretold, he shall be saved, and shall see my salvation and the end of the world. Now, I hope you can see the relationship here between this particular passage from 4th Ezra and Matthew 24. Goes on to say that there'll be quaking of lands, tumult of peoples, scheming of nations, confusion of leaders, disquietude of princes. It is of these things that the Most High has spoken since the days from the beginning. So you see, this isn't pulled out of a vacuum, that these writings from all these various parts, from John in Revelation, from Daniel, from 4th Ezra, from a lot of the other pseudepigrapha writings from Enoch, all have similar themes, and they're all sort of bouncing off one another. And they all have, within the descriptions, this idea of the birth pangs to come. As we'll go back to Matthew 24 here, because I believe it's kind of a roadmap, an eschatological roadmap for the end of days. And of course, Yeshua is speaking to his Talmudim, his disciples, and they say, well, what is the sign of your coming, and when will the age end? And how does he respond? He says, you will hear the noise of wars near and far. People will fight against each other. Nation will fight against nation. There'll be famines, pestilence, earthquakes in diverse places. All this is the beginning of birth pangs. So very similar to some of the descriptions that we have in 4th Ezra. And this is the Matthew 24, so of course the Olivet Discourse there. And talking about the coming forth of all these events, these cataclysmic events at a time appointed by God, described as the birth pangs. Now, I'd like to go over to Romans 8, because Rav Shaul, or Paul, describes a similar concept. And he says in Romans 8:28, "We know that until now the whole creation has been groaning, as with the pains of childbirth. And not only it, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we continue waiting eagerly to be made sons, to have our whole bodies redeemed and set free. It was in this hope that we are saved." So once again, the idea of them being saved associated with this time of the birth pangs, that out of it will come their salvation, will come their deliverance, will come their final redemption. And so in Romans here again we see this comparison of children coming forth in pain. So with the association of the birth pangs of the Messiah, we have the redemption of the land, we have the coming forth of children, we have the judgment on the nations. All these things are part of the birth pangs of the Messiah. Further says there in Romans 8 that the Spirit bears witness that we are the children of God. And so we see the whole creation groaning to bring forth these children, groaning and experiencing birth pangs for the coming of the kingdom. And so the coming of the kingdom does have other aspects to it, not just the kingdom. But as I said, the time of salvation, deliverance, the redemption of the land, and the judgment on the nations. Now there are, the rabbis from the Talmudic period say there are two reoccurring situations for the messianic travail to come forth. One is forgetting the Torah, the other is a scarcity or shortage of disciples or Talmudim. And Rabbi Eliezer, when asked, "What must a man do to be spared the pangs of the Messiah?" he answered, "Let him busy himself with the Torah and the practice of good deeds, or mitzvot." So this was his answer to how do we deal with the birth pangs of the Messiah. And it goes back to what I've been saying through all this series of Design in Scripture, that we must study the Torah, and we must do acts of charity to help those in need, the widows and the orphans, etc. So that's session 1. Now we're going to move on into session 2. See you then.